I'm Nina Lockwood, founder and director of Intuitive Interim and Executive Search. A very warm welcome to Bernie Payne, legal and compliance consultant of Labvolution Limited. I've been working with Bernie for the last few months, focusing on Intuitive's approach to IR35 and the legislations that changed considerably in April 2021. Bernie will talk us through the changes, giving headlines in relation to the new rules that have been in place for the last 3 months. She'll also talk about the market reaction so far and does a Q&A with some real live questions from our clients and our candidates. I hope you enjoy. Bernie Payne, good morning and welcome to, you are our very first intuitive expert on the podcast. How exciting is that?
That is super exciting, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for asking me.
I have genuinely been looking forward to this podcast, which for anyone who knows me will know that spending, 45 minutes to an hour talking about tax legislation is not normally one of my specialist or favourite subjects. However, just for the benefit of the audience, you and I have known each other for a few months now. I came across you on an expert panel that the Recruitment Network ran, I believe, on IR35. And this is a subject which has been obviously around for a while. Public sector have had it in place for longer, but as of the 6th of April this year, 2021, we've had the joy of having it introduced into the private sector for contract recruitment. I was terrified of it, Bernie, as you know. So when I saw you on that expert panel, I thought, my God, this person is normal. She's approachable. I can understand her. And so I absolutely blessed the day I saw you on that panel, because we've worked with you ever since. And me and the team are massively grateful to you for all the advice, and not just the expert advice, but the patience that you have shown with us. And obviously you've had conversations with some of our clients as well, and we've been able to support our candidates so much better having the benefit of your advice. So today's session, I really wanted to have the opportunity, 3 months on from the introduction of IR35, to find out from you, how's it gone, Bernie? What's happened? Is everybody loving it? Was it all just a fuss to be made and, much ado about nothing? So I'm looking forward to hearing an update. And then we've got a Q&A session where some of our clients and our candidates have sent some questions in that they would like your help with. So I'm going to hand over to you to tell us all about IR35.
Great, thanks, Nina. So I'm just going to share my screen so that we can go through some slides. And I'm going to start with a very high-level overview of the rules themselves. But I'm not going to be going into loads of detail, mostly because of time constraints. And trust me, we could spend hours talking about the new rules, and Nina can because she had to endure a 6-hour IR35 workshop with me previously. And, even then, we by no means covered every single detail. But, as Nina mentioned, today the focus is really on the market reactions to the rules since go live and answering some, specific questions. So we're only going to spend about 20 minutes on what the actual rules are. So let's get started. So first of all, some context, really. So the UK only has 2 tax statuses. So an individual is either employed or self-employed for tax purposes. So if you are not one, you are the other. Now that means tax status is very different to employment status for the purposes of employment rights and protections, which, as most of you will probably know, gives kind of 3 options: employee, worker, self-employed. And it's really important when we're talking about tax that you don't confuse it with employment status for rights. So the 2 regimes are similar in some respects, but for the purposes of the off-payroll rules, the new IR35 rules, it's best to try to keep them completely separate in your mind. So when I use the terminology employed or self-employed, I'm going to be referring to the tax status, not the right status. And I'll make it obvious if that's not the case.
Okay.
If you have an employed status for tax, then income tax, employees' national insurance contributions, which I normally refer to as NICs, and employers' NICs, that's payable on the total assignment income, just like how an employee is paid. Conversely, if you have a self-employed status for tax, the assignment income is not considered earnings from employment, and therefore a different tax and NICs treatment applies. So when you're self-employed, the company who pays you isn't required to deduct any income tax or any NICs from you, nor is it required to pay any employer's NICs, and you don't count towards their apprenticeship levy numbers either. Now, the tax treatment that applies when you are self-employed does depend on the payroll mechanism that you're using. But when you work via an intermediary, like a limited company, for example, most of the income that you generate as a business is taken out of the company as dividends. And that results in less tax and no NICs being payable. And that in turn means you have a higher overall take-home pay when you have a self-employed status for tax versus an employed status for tax. Now, in order for the off-payroll rules to even need to be considered, the worker has to be using an intermediary to supply his or her services, and he or she must have some element of ownership or beneficial interest in that intermediary. Now, I would say over 90% of the contractors affected by the off-payroll rules are using a limited company, their own limited company, as that intermediary. And we normally refer to those types of contractors as personal service company contractors, or PSCs. Now, if the worker is using a PSC and they hold any degree of ownership of any of the shares of the PSC, then that PSC is in scope. However, some contractors may use a partnership arrangement instead of a limited company, and under those circumstances, the worker providing the services must be a partner of that partnership and entitled to 60% or more of the profits. Now, the reason why I mention this is because of this requirement for the worker to provide his or her services via an intermediary in which he or she holds some form of ownership or interest. That by definition means that any PAYE workers, any umbrella company contractors, or any sole traders are excluded from the IR35 regime. So for those types of contractors, other tax rules apply, but not IR35 or off payroll. So these rules only apply to contractors working through their own limited company or a partnership.
Okay.
Now, the original IR35 rules were implemented in the year 2000. Thank you very much, Gordon Brown. And they are set out in Chapter 8 of ITPA, which is the Income Tax, Earnings and Pensions Act. And the aim of this IR35 legislation was to stop individuals gaining the tax and NICs advantages of working via a PSC when actually those individuals were not genuinely self-employed for tax purposes. And the rules made it a requirement for individuals to prove their self-employment status in order to benefit from those tax efficiencies. And if you couldn't prove to HMRC that you were genuinely self-employed, then you would have to pay income tax and NICs in the same way that employees do. And the original rules made contractors responsible for determining their own tax status, and any misclassification of that status was between HMRC and the contractor. There were no responsibilities or liabilities on any agencies or any end clients at all. However, suffice to say, HMRC was not at all effective at enforcing the original IR35 rules. So in 2017, they changed the regime for public authorities by introducing the off-payroll rules. And then, of course, April 2021, very similar rules went live for the private sector as well. Now, just to clarify a bit of terminology at this point, the terms IR35 and off-payroll are generally used interchangeably. Now, technically, IR35 relates to the original regime that was implemented in the year 2000, and off-payroll relates to the 2021 rules. But most people refer to them using either term, so I'll do the same. Now, if you are genuinely self-employed when you use a PSC, you are considered to be outside IR35, that is, outside the scope of the IR35 regime. Whereas if you are employed for tax purposes, you are inside IR35. So that's the terminology that I'll use. And the difference for a contractor between being inside IR35 and outside IR35 in terms of take-home pay is round about 20 to 30% difference. So we are not talking just a few pounds here and there. It is a really significant difference in take-home pay if a contractor is determined to be inside IR35. So what are the off-payroll rules and what do clients have to do to comply with them? Well, firstly, there is an exemption for any clients who are small or based wholly outside the UK, as defined in the legislation and HMRC guidance. But the vast majority of private sector companies who regularly engage contractors are not exempt and therefore would have to comply with the rules. And clients who are affected by the off-payroll rules have to do a number of things. Firstly, they have to determine the IR35 status of every PSC assignment using established case law principles, which we'll come on to in just a minute. They have to take reasonable care when making determinations. And HMRC defines reasonable care as acting in a way that would be expected of a prudent and reasonable person in the client's position. They need to issue a status determination statement, or SDS, to the PSC and to any recruitment agency who might be supplying that PSC onto the end client. And in order to be valid, the SDS must set out what the IR35 status is, that is, whether it's inside or outside IR35, and the client's reasons for arriving at that conclusion. Now, although the client obviously has to do that at the very start of an assignment, they also have to monitor any changes to those assignments over time, because of course that might lead to a change in IR35 status. And finally, clients are required by law to implement a status disagreement process, which allows contractors or the agency supplying that contractor to challenge the client's decision. And that process has certain minimum requirements. Now, we're not going to be covering the status disagreement process in any detail today, just because of time. Excuse me. So next, let's look at the fee payer responsibilities. And the fee payer is the company that sits closest to the PSC in the contractual chain. Now, if a client engages a PSC directly with no agency in the chain, the client will be the fee payer, as well as having those additional client responsibilities. But if the client engages a recruitment agency to source and supply that PSC to them, then the agency is the fee payer. Now, it's really important to note that fee payers are not required to do status determinations themselves. That is always the responsibility of the client. The fee payer does have to take certain actions depending on the SDS that is issued by the client, though. So if the client determines that the role is inside IR35, which is, as we know, that means that the contractor is employed for tax purposes for that assignment, well, then the fee payer must make the appropriate deductions for income tax and NICs and pay them to HMRC. If the client determines that the role is outside IR35, that is self-employed for tax purposes, well, then the fee payer simply pays the PSC without any deductions at all. So what happens if clients, or fee payers for that matter, don't comply with their obligations under the off-payroll rules? Well, they will be liable to HMRC for all the unpaid income tax and NICs, and potentially the apprenticeship levy as well, if it applies, that should have been paid to HMRC for that assignment and weren't. And those costs alone can easily add up to tens of thousands of pounds per contractor per tax year. So if you're a company that engages with a lot of contractors, you could be exposed to hundreds of thousands or even millions of pounds in liabilities if you don't comply in full with your obligations. HMRC will also charge interest on the tax and NICs if the non-compliance relates to previous tax years. Now, before anyone starts panicking, there aren't any retrospective liabilities under the off-payroll rules. So any liabilities will only relate to the 2021-22 tax year onwards for private sector clients. But just because you don't get a knock on the door from HMRC in 2021 doesn't mean HMRC can't investigate and hold you liable in later years for what you've done or not done during 2021. And actually, HMRC tends to enforce about 4 years in arrears. So it is perfectly possible to be investigated and penalised in 4 years' time for what you do or don't do in the current tax year. So those interest payments alone can also be significant. And finally, of course, HMRC can impose additional penalties simply by virtue of the fact that you haven't complied with your legal obligations. Now, let's take a very, very quick look at how IR35 status is actually determined, because that is one of the most complex parts of this piece of legislation. How do I do an IR35 status determination that is accurate? Well, the factors that determine whether someone is inside or outside IR35 are not written into primary legislation in the form of an Act of Parliament or similar. Instead, the factors have evolved through case law, and by that I mean tax tribunal hearings. So the problem is there's no easy checklist, no one-page overview that tells you everything that you need to know. It really is a complex, subtle, nuanced test that is highly subjective and case-specific. Now, when assessing IR35 status, you should look at both the contractual arrangements and the day-to-day working practices. Both of those should be considered. And if the contract doesn't reflect the reality, it'll be disregarded. So it's really the everyday working arrangements that determine status, not the contractual documents. The factors that are shown in bold on the slide, they are the most important factors. So I'll go into just very brief detail about each of those three. Now, mutuality of you would think I would have this down by now. I've said it so many times. Mutuality of obligation is the first one. And actually, a few recent IR35 cases have really kind of focused on this factor. So a feature of genuine self-employment is that the client has no obligation to offer work to the PSC on an ongoing basis. And similarly, the PSC has no implicit or explicit obligation to accept or undertake any work that might be offered by the client. So once an assignment ends, the client can't simply expect that that contractor will agree to a new assignment with that client and carry on working. And similarly, the contractor can't expect that any further work will be offered by that client. So an absence of any mutual obligation between the client and the contractor to offer work and accept and perform work, that is an indicator of being outside IR35. The next factor is control. So if a client doesn't really have any right to control the manner in which the PSC performs the services, that's a very strong indicator of being outside IR35. So the ideal scenario is that the client and the contractor agree what needs to be done at the start of an assignment, but it is the contractor that determines how the work is best completed, and also preferably, but to a lesser extent, when and where the work is done. The client shouldn't be allowed to simply move the worker from job to job or change the nature of the services being delivered by the contractor without agreeing a new contract and a new assignment, because that indicates that the client controls and determines the way in which the PSC works. And the last factor is personal service. So if the PSC has a relatively unfettered right to use any resources it chooses to complete the services, again, that's a very strong indicator that an assignment is outside IR35. Conversely, if you think about an employment relationship, it's the employee, him or herself, who has to go to work every day. That employee can't send their husband or their wife or a friend of theirs to go to work in their place. So to show self-employment, really the PSC should be able to use substitutes or helpers or subcontractors to complete the services. Now, none of these factors on their own will determine status, but generally, if a court can determine status when considering just those three factors, then that's what they'll do. And they may not even need to address any of the other factors shown on the slide. Most commonly, though, there isn't a clear-cut answer from considering just those three factors. So that's when the others come into play. So, firstly, how integrated is the contractor into the client's own workforce? Are they part and parcel of the client's business and treated just like an employee? Because if they are, that indicates that they might be inside IR35. On the flip side, if the contractor is treated differently and can't access or use the client's internal policies and procedures that are aimed at its own employees, they can't access their facilities or their benefits, that's more an indicator of being outside IR35. Does the contractor have a genuine business? Does he or she actively market their services to different clients? Does he or she have their own office space, even if that's a home office, like my one here? Yeah. And does the contractor have their own insurances to cover the services that they provide? Do they have to invest their own money into ongoing professional development and gaining additional qualifications? So the more a contractor can show that he or she is running a viable business in its own right, the better. Financial risk is also very important. The more risk a contractor takes on, the more likely they are to be outside IR35. So that includes things like putting right errors or defects at the contractor's own time and cost. Mm-hmm. Profit from sound management is the contractor's ability to negotiate his or her own rates and to make a profit from his or her activities. Now, that means ideally contractors should be able to work for multiple clients at the same time. But if that isn't the case and contractors work only for one client at a time, that is not fatal in terms of determining status. And finally, if the contractor provides his or her own equipment, tools, materials, etc., that's also an indicator of being outside IR35. It's really only relevant to very high value equipment, though. We're not really talking using their own mobile phone or their own laptop. So now we know that clients have to undertake IR35 status assessments for all PSC contractors, and we very quickly looked at what the factors are that determine IR35 status. But neither of those things really tell a client how to conduct an accurate status assessment. Now, clients can choose to use their own in-house experts to undertake assessments, but that's pretty rare. Most clients simply don't have sufficient knowledge within their organisations because they've never had IR35 or off payroll obligations until a few months ago. So many will use a status assessment tool, or they will outsource the whole assessment process to a third party. And both of those options are absolutely fine and perfectly acceptable. providing clients appreciate that they remain legally liable for the decision that is given by the tool or the third-party expert. So they can't absolve themselves of their legal liabilities, but they can use additional resources. Now, a common approach that has been used by clients is to make use of HMRC's own status assessment tool. It's called Check Employment Status for Tax, very catchy, or CEST for short. Now, using CEST is not mandatory, and actually it has a lot of failings, which I will come on to. So many clients prefer to use a third party with IR35 expertise rather than CEST, because they feel that it will give them a more accurate outcome. And that's absolutely fine to use that third party, but a lot of clients don't do enough due diligence on those third party suppliers, and they don't ensure that they are genuine experts in this really very niche area of law. And because they remain legally liable, it does potentially put them at risk. So that was our whistle-stop tour of what the rules actually are. Fabulous. So let's get on to the kind of the market reactions. Where are we 3 months later? What have we seen? What have people been doing? And where do I see the sort of the market continuing to go? Well, firstly, and despite HMRC's best efforts, if you can call them that, at educating businesses about the new rules, there is still an enormous lack of awareness and understanding within the client community. And Nina, I know you and I have had that conversation a couple of times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really surprised, if not shocked, on a number of occasions, from a client perspective, but also from a candidate perspective. So we have had interim contractors who have just carried on in their existing, working to their existing practices, with no or little knowledge of the fact that there's even been a change, which is interesting.
Yeah, and your experience is not uncommon. There are lots of companies still who make use of contractors that aren't aware of the rules or aren't fully complying with them. And it's very easy for me to say, but it won't take long for HMRC to start enforcing the rules. So for anyone who isn't as prepared as they should be, you really need to prioritize getting this right.
It's not going away, is it, Bernie? I think there was almost this kind of like, well, if I don't look at it, if I don't, if I ignore it, it might go away. And I was probably guilty of that, probably 18 months ago, because obviously we had a delay, didn't we? The COVID pandemic allowed us a 12-month period of grace before it actually came in. So I do think there has been an element, if I don't look at it and I pretend it's not there, it will go away, but it isn't going anywhere, is it?
No, and I think that's the thing. I think because the delay was given due to COVID, and of course we were still in such a very difficult place, and of course still are even now with COVID, in April 2021, there was an assumption it would be delayed again. But of course, the government has spent billions and billions on supporting individuals and businesses, and what they have used is their tax revenue money. So they need to make that back in order to be able to pay for public services. So there was no chance that they were going to delay it again, because they need the money, that the extra tax and NICs that are going to be paid once these rules went live. And all the time that they were delaying it, they just saw this as a huge cash cow that they couldn't get their hands on. So, there was no doubt in my mind that it was going to go ahead in 2021, and of course it did.
Yeah.
But what I would say is, even clients who were aware of the rules before the deadline, they started their implementation activities really late. Again, possibly because of the hope that the legislation might be delayed again, but actually more likely they just didn't realise the amount of work that they would need to do to get it right. And that in turn led to some companies putting in place what we call blanket bans. So rather than undertake all the necessary steps to comply with the off-payroll rules, and I don't underestimate just how significant that is, but if companies left it too late, they got themselves into a bit of a panic and ended up making a policy decision to refuse to engage with limited company contractors at all. And they forced all of their limited company contractors to change their payroll mechanism to PAYE via an agency or to use a PAYE umbrella company. The reasoning being, well, if I as a client, if I'm not engaging any PSCs, whether directly or through an agency, I don't have to do any IR35 status assessments. Problem solved, right? In their mind, at least. However, clients mistakenly believed that contractors would be desperate for work in the light of COVID and the economic downturn, and would therefore simply accept such a massive reduction in their take-home pay, and that they would continue in their current assignment. And that simply wasn't the case. You know, demand for contractors has increased over the last 8 months because clients are hesitant to hire permanent employees during such uncertain times, but they still need certain skills and expertise. So they engage contractors for those skills instead. And the companies that just banned the use of PSCs entirely, well, they couldn't and still can't find good contractors for their temporary roles, because they took quite a narrow and short-sighted view of the admin burden of the legislation. And in just these first 3 months, we've already seen many clients overturn those blanket bans, and they have started to re-engage with PSCs and do the assessments, etc., because they just couldn't deliver on their obligations to their own customers without those skill sets. And no contractors were willing to work with them because there are a lot of contract roles out there in the market at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing that, Bernie. I can definitely agree with what you're saying there.
Yeah. A lot of clients, I think, did try to assess IR35 status of their contractors properly, and that was definitely a positive thing. But there were an awful lot of clients who chose to use a poor assessment partner or tool, and that has led to different but equally important implications. So some clients chose to use the government's own tool, CEST, and I can see the reasons why. It is issued by HMRC, it's automated, it's a multiple choice questionnaire, it's freely available on the gov.uk website, and it supposedly allows clients a quick way, free way to determine IR35 status. The problem is CEST is not a good tool. So the questions and the multiple choice answers, they are difficult to understand, just the questions and just the answers. And therefore, it's actually really hard to answer them in a way that you feel is exactly right and comfortable and correct.
Yeah.
But the second biggest failing is that the algorithm that determines the status kind of behind the scenes is way too simple. And in over 20% of cases, the CEST tool can't even give you an outcome.
Yeah.
It just says cannot determine.
Yeah.
But most importantly, the tool simply doesn't align with established IR35 case law. So that means that clients who use the tool may get the wrong outcome. So if you input the details of all the IR35 cases that have been heard by a tax tribunal into the CEST tool, taking each case, one CEST determination for each case, you get the wrong outcome or no outcome at all, nearly 50% of the time.
Oh my goodness.
So
Wow. Okay.
Clients may use CEST to determine status, but that doesn't mean the outcome is the right one.
No.
Now, to allay those fears, because the tool's failings are, widely publicised, HMRC have said, we will stand by any status assessments given by the CEST tool. And that's another reason why clients have flocked to using it. But unfortunately, that's just not true. And you can ask NHS Digital, who were fined over £4 million in unpaid tax and NICs, despite the fact that they used the CEST tool.
Oh my good grief.
And that liability, that £4 million liability, was established in 18 months. That's just taking 18 months worth of assignments. So clients are now realizing just how flawed the CEST tool is, and are instead engaging with third-party experts to decide status for their current and any new contractors. But, even when using a third party, there are good ones and bad ones. And many clients are using bad IR35 review companies, which is exposing them to risk because they retain the legal responsibility for the outcomes. Now, one common problem that I've certainly seen in the market are assessment companies that require the contractor to complete questionnaires about their assignments, as opposed to someone in the client organisation taking on that responsibility.
Yeah, we've seen this.
And some clients even require the contractor to pay for those assessments, even though the client is the party that is legally obliged to make the status determination. Now, I do understand it's easier because clients get contractors to answer the questions about IR35, so they don't have to. They don't have to make the time and expend the energy doing that. And of course, they don't have to incur any cost. But that simply doesn't hold up, because if the client isn't actually actively engaged in determining status themselves, and the contractor is the one doing all the work to get the role assessed, I just don't think that HMRC will believe that the client has taken reasonable care. And if that's the case, then the client is then exposed to all the liabilities we've already discussed.
I think it raises a question with me in relation to if it's the contractor who is completing the tool alongside third-party expert, then with the best will in the world, even the people who are acting with the utmost integrity, there is going to be something going on at some level of the brain that says, I want the outcome to be outside IR35, because otherwise I'm going to be, as you said earlier, 20 to 30% worse off in terms of my take-home pay. So I'm not for 1 minute suggesting, certainly, that any of our intuitive contractors would be looking at that assessment and saying, right, how do I wangle this to get the right outcome? But human nature would dictate that if there's a question that could go either way and is open to interpretation, which a lot of this stuff is, you'd go with the outside IR35 option, wouldn't you? I would.
Yeah. And the thing is that, now that the off-payroll rules are live, for any clients who do have to apply the off-payroll rules, as we said, there are these exemptions, small companies and wholly overseas. But for the clients who do have to apply the off-payroll rules, contractors have no liabilities under the off-payroll rules at all, unless they provide fraudulent information. And fraudulent information or documentation, that's actually a very high barrier. That's not just, taking a slightly more positive view of your working arrangements. You have to actively lie and seek to deceive. So if contractors fill in these questionnaires and answer questions about working practices, as you said, they are minded to seek the most positive outcome, and that wouldn't be fraudulent information or documentation. So a client could end up getting a wrong outcome through no fault of their own, but the fault of the client is to make the contractor be doing those assessments. So there is a way to stop that, which is that the client is the one who should be actively engaged in liaising with that third-party assessment company, and they are the ones that should explain the actual day-to-day working arrangements. The other thing you need to bear in mind is that using contractors to answer questions about assignments only works if the contractor's already in the assignment.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't work for any new status determinations that generally clients are now issuing before the role starts, because actually most agencies don't even like to advertise a role without being able to state whether the role is inside or outside IR35. So you can't have a contractor who hasn't even started the role yet answer questions about their IR35 status, because they simply won't know.
No.
So that's another factor as well. And I know we've got a question about that coming up in a bit, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But I think, the thing is that if as a client you are using a third-party assessor that focuses solely on contractors answering questions, and contractors are paying for that assessment, I cannot see a way that with a straight face you can argue to HMRC that you took reasonable care. I just don't see how that's going to be possible. But that is only my opinion. And of course, I don't work in HMRC's enforcement team. So, it's my opinion. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is that, clients forget that contractors are generally very close-knit communities, and they share a lot of information between them. Including what position a client has taken in relation to the off-payroll rules. And that sort of exchange of information, as well as a few very high-profile forums and websites that actively name and shame clients who have put in place blanket bans, or who are using the CEST tool or some other flawed assessment methodology, means that talent attraction in a tight market is proving really difficult for some clients. So they are reassessing their position, and they're making better choices about how to accurately and fairly assess IR35 status in the future. Now I just want to move on to insurance. So IR35 insurance is a brand new product on the market, and is designed to insure against your liabilities under the off-payroll rules if and when a role is assessed by a client to be outside IR35, but HMRC disagrees. And just like IR35 review companies, there are good insurance policies and there are bad ones. The vast majority of the insurance policies on the market are bad ones, which quite frankly either won't pay out when you try to claim, or will only cover some of your liability because the indemnity limit simply is nowhere near high enough. So if you are considering IR35 insurance, you should research all the products on the market and read the policy, and particularly the limits, exceptions, and exclusions really carefully. Some of these insurance policies are aimed at individual contractors rather than the client purchasing the insurance at that level. And that to me is a real problem. Because when a contractor purchases the IR35 insurance, first of all, it's at their cost, which I would argue is not that fair. But secondly, it is the contractor who is the policy holder. Now, the insurance may well cover the client and any agency in the chain as something called additional insureds, but they are not the policy holders. So clients and agencies can't activate a claim themselves. They need the contractor to start the claim process for them to gain the benefit of the insurance cover. And of course, contractors can and will just refuse to do so. They just will refuse to activate the claim, or they won't maintain the insurance for 4 or 5 years after that assignment ends. That means the client just won't get the benefit of the cover at all. Also, since the rules went live, there have been obviously a huge increase in the number of contractors who work via a PAYE umbrella company. Often if a PSC is assessed to be inside IR35, they will move to an umbrella instead of continuing to use their own company for that assignment. And some recent research conducted by a very large contractor accountancy firm indicates that over 70% of contractors who were deemed inside IR35 by their client are now working through an umbrella company. Right. And, I'm a big fan of umbrella companies. They are very legitimate, payroll mechanisms. But the umbrella industry is completely unregulated, meaning that, again, good ones and bad ones. And what some clients don't appreciate, and actually some agencies as well, is that they may be liable for any tax avoidance or tax evasion by that umbrella company. And there are actually a few different pieces of legislation that can expose clients to that risk. So one of which would be the offshore intermediaries legislation, but also the Criminal Finances Act and the enabling legislation. So both clients and agencies need to be conducting really thorough due diligence on any umbrella companies that they allow into their supply chains.
Yeah. And we've talked about this, haven't we, Bernie? And you've helped Intuitive put together an approved supplier list of umbrella companies that we've been really happy with. We're delighted with the people that we're working with. But I remember you saying to me, this isn't just the due diligence in terms of the financial conduct of the organisation. This is the level of service that they offer as well. So there are two sides to this. It's, yes, absolutely. They have to be capable of paying, of complying with the legislation, obviously, making sure that the tax and the NICs are paid. But the other side to it, for me, is how they treat the contractors. Because we are, we bend over backwards to treat our interim contractors well. So we want to make sure that any partners that we're working with have got the same standard of service. So that's really important as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's the due diligence that you do on umbrella companies. Yes, of course, you need to consider the tax, but it's, don't let the tax tail wag the dog, if you like. So you have to look at the holistic viewpoint when you're considering umbrella companies. Yes, they must be compliant, but that isn't the be all and end all. There are really compliant umbrella companies who give really bad service to you as an agency and to your contractors. And all of that leads to dissatisfaction, the potential for reputational damage, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a good umbrella company will enhance your reputation and your customer service, but a bad one can undermine everything that you do well by doing what they do badly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the last point that I just want to mention is around employment rights. So as we said at the very beginning, tax status is unrelated to employment status for the purposes of rights and protections. So it is perfectly possible for someone to be considered employed for tax purposes, but self-employed for rights purposes, meaning they have no rights or protections.
Yeah.
And since April, there's been a lot of press around the unfairness of contractors being treated as an employee for tax purposes, meaning they pay full PAYE, but they get no employment rights or protections in return. It's called, no rights employment, and it is gaining a lot of media attention. So I would encourage end clients to make sure that any PSCs who are determined to be inside IR35 are at least offered other payroll mechanisms by their agency, such as agency PAYE or umbrella.
Yeah.
Because when a contractor works as an agency PAYE worker or via a PAYE compliant umbrella, they will gain basic rights and protections as a worker. So they will not be an employee, but they will not be self-employed. They sit in that middle ground of worker. And I think failing to make other options available to contractors who are deemed inside IR35 can really result in negative publicity and reduce both an agency's ability, but certainly an end client's ability to attract talent in the future as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my slides now so we can see our lovely faces more clearly.
The poster girls for IR35, Bernie.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought it? You've done a brilliant job there. There's the points that you've covered in terms of the market reaction to IR35 and some of the issues that we've seen at Intuitive that our clients have shared with us, and that increasing amount of interim contractors have raised concerns about. You've covered loads. As you know, part of this session, we wanted to give our clients and our candidates the opportunity to ask their own questions, to kind of work out, just to I suppose to get the benefit of your expertise and the opportunity to pick your brain. So we've got a few questions to run through. The first of which comes from one of our clients. How do you propose an organisation should advertise a role ahead of IR35 status being applied, as it's not always possible to tell if the role will be inside or outside, as it will partly depend on the circumstances of the contractor who is hired? Great question.
That is a great question. And I have a fairly simple answer, but it is not a popular one. So in my view, and I do know IR35 better than most, 99 times out of 100, you do not need an individual contractor's input to get an IR35 status decision. Now, as I said, I know that statement is quite controversial, and contractors in particular won't like that answer because they want to input, and I believe they should be given the option to input. But I believe that 99 times out of 100, that isn't necessary. It's encouraged, but not necessary in order to get an IR35 status decision. And the IR35 case law that have already gone through the courts does support my statement. I'll explain why. The three most important factors when deciding IR35 status are, as we've already talked about, mutuality of obligation, control, personal service. Now, those three factors are determined more by the client and their behaviours and their culture than any individual contractor.
Okay.
And the same goes actually for most of the other factors that are less important or, hold less weighting, such as integration, financial risk. It's really the client that determines the degree to the degree to which those factors are present or absent. It really isn't the contractor that determines how much he or she is controlled by the client. It is not the contractor that determines whether he or she can send a substitute. It is not the contractor that determines how the client treats them in terms of how integrated they are in the business. So for the vast majority of roles, clients can undertake a status assessment ahead of that role starting and have confidence that it's correct, depending, of course, on the quality of the tool or methodology that they're using to determine status.
Yeah.
But really the only circumstance where you would need a contractor's input is in need. As I said, I encourage clients to engage and have contractors' input, but I don't think it is necessary, except if you have to ask the contractor if they have multiple concurrent clients, or if they are having to incur significant equipment or materials costs that the client might be unaware of. But both of those are pretty low priority factors. They don't hold a lot of weight or water in terms of the assessment outcome as a whole.
Yeah.
So you'd only need that information if the status of the assessment so far, looking at all the other factors, was right on that dividing line of being inside and outside IR35. And in all honesty, that is rarely the case.
And am I right here, Bernie, when we are working on the assumption that the IR35 status is on the role and not on the individual contractor who is performing the role?
So there are quite polarized views on those in the market generally. And to be honest, I lean more towards the role based rather than the individual based. But having said that, mine is more for reasons of pragmatism than anything else. So I understand that, doing individual contractor specific assessments every single time is the ideal. I do understand that. But as I said, most of the time, if you have 4 design engineers, say, working at the same client, on the same site, with the same, client engagement manager, what we probably would used to call a hiring manager, but we don't anymore because of IR35. And then the chances are, if they're doing the same role, they are looked after or overseen by the same individual in the client business. They're on the same site and they're at the company is the same. I can't see that there would be massive variations between their IR35 assessment outcome.
Yeah.
As I said, you may have 2 that have no other clients and 2 that do have other clients. But the chances are, if that client has taken good advice about how best to structure their whole business and their whole culture in terms of engaging and interacting with limited company contractors, then if the client is saying, we will agree what you need to do, but you determine when and where you do it, you can use a substitute, but we would appreciate wherever possible, you would at least let us know. And they may need to undertake some direct undertakings in terms of confidentiality. And this is for a specific 3-month project, and there are no circumstances under which that might be extended. Those contractors will be very clearly outside IR35, regardless of those 2 that have other clients and the 2 that don't.
Yeah.
So I think from a client's perspective, they need to work more on their overarching policies and procedures about how they, as a business, engage with contractors. And if they have that standardized and that is clearly communicated and understood within all business units of the client's organization, then you can do role-based assessments, which give you economies of scale. Yeah. And that, I think, for clients will be a big deal if they use a lot of contractors.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. The next question, Bernie, is around the blanket approach that so many clients are taking to IR35. So a candidate has sent a question in to us. Say the company I was contracted to insisted that I and every other contract on site was inside IR35. I had my contract reviewed at my own expense by an external review company, which determined that I was outside IR35, but my client wouldn't change their decision. I understood that each case had to be judged individually and that it was illegal to take a blanket approach, yet many clients are taking that approach. Why isn't this being addressed through the legal process? So obviously you have talked about some of this in your market update, that this is starting to change, but a good question there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this individual is absolutely right. Every case has to be judged individually or at a role level, in the sense that clients are not allowed to take a blanket approach. I think the word illegal is a bit strong, but it is in breach of the off-payroll rules for a client to take a decision that everyone is inside IR35 without doing a proper assessment. So they can't deem every contractor to be inside IR35 because that won't be reasonable care. Now, I was obviously heavily involved in the consultation process with HMRC, as I was for the public sector changes as well. So I had many long, difficult, frustrating, loud conversations with HMRC around this issue of clients who will take a blanket ban approach. We all knew that it would happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, HMRC were not overly open to trying to prevent that. However, they did put in the final wording of the legislation that if a client doesn't take reasonable care and assess each role individually, then, i.e., if they take a blanket ban and say everyone's inside IR35, then that client will be responsible for all the liabilities under the off-payroll rules, even if those liabilities have already been paid by another party. So what I mean by that is, if a client says all PSCs are inside IR35 and we're not going to assess properly, and even though all of those PSC workers are then paying income tax and NICs that is payable under those assignments, therefore, in theory, there are no liabilities to HMRC because the tax and NICs is being paid.
Yeah.
If HMRC finds that the client has taken a blanket approach, the client can be charged the same amount again for every contractor that was included in that blanket ban.
Okay.
So if the client has a lot of PSC contractors, obviously those liabilities will be in the millions, per tax year, every year from 2021 onwards. So there are provisions in the legislation to deal with that. But as with all tax legislation, we are all beholden to HMRC focusing on the fact that too much tax might be paid instead of not enough. So that is part of the problem, is that HMRC's first activity when it comes to enforcement is not going to be looking for clients who have taken blanket bans. They're going to be looking for clients who haven't done anything. And it may take them quite a while to get to the point that they may start looking at clients who may have taken blanket bans. And it's, that's the difficulty, really.
Yeah, that's definitely a big challenge. But I guess, to come back to a point you made earlier, in terms of talent attraction, those organisations who are implementing a blanket ban are at risk of having the top talent saying, no, thank you very much. I'm happy if we go through a status determination and we do it properly. And if it is inside or if it's outside, then, we pay your money, you take your chance. But actually, those organisations who are doing the blanket ban, I think, are going to find it more and more challenging as time moves on to attract the talent that they need to be able to do the work that needs to be done. So time will tell.
Yeah. But I think there are also, you need to think about the admin burden. Contractors who are blanket ban deemed inside IR35, they will dispute and challenge that determination.
Yeah.
So, and if this particular contractor who asked this question hasn't issued a formal challenge to the client, and they must by law implement a process to deal with status disagreements for contractors.
Yeah.
And they will be exposed to all the liabilities if they don't, you should issue a formal challenge. And I think a lot of clients just didn't realize just how much pushback they would get. And I've seen clients who did blanket determinations that everyone's inside. And the sheer number of challenges that they then got in, that they then had to deal with straight after the 6th of April, means they're already now looking to change that, and that they are going to, assess fairly. But there's the increased costs as well. Most roles are genuinely outside IR35.
Yeah.
And those roles inside IR35, contractors are demanding higher rates to offset the difference. So why wouldn't you assess fairly? If most of your roles are outside IR35, you don't need to increase rates. But if everyone's inside, you're really going to struggle, because contractors will continue to demand higher rates to offset the difference.
Yeah. Next question. I am contracted to a small company under the current threshold for IR35 changes. The work is scoped and contracts are written to be outside IR35. However, I believe the onus for determining status remains with the contractor. I was wondering what would happen if the company took a contract with a larger organisation, large enough to be in scope for the IR35 changes, on a time and materials basis. At what point could this larger organisation, as the eventual end client, become responsible for determining a contractor's IR35 status, even though the contractor was working for the small company in the middle?
Okay. So I'll deal with the first point first, which is if you, as a contractor, a PSC contractor, if you are supplying services to a small company as defined by the legislation, and it is quite complex, so I'm not going to go into that in any major detail, but if they are small, then yes, the individual PSC retains the responsibility of determining their own IR35 status. So where the off-payroll rules aren't applicable because the client is small or wholly overseas, the original IR35 rules sit in their place, which is that individual contractors determine their own status and are liable to HMRC for any misclassification. So the contractor is right. It is them that determines their own IR35 status. So now on to the second part around sort of clients and customers, if you like, and how that works. So if the small company that is engaging this PSC, let's call them company A, is supplying services to a larger customer, company B, then the client, for the purposes of the off-payroll rules, so the business who needs to make IR35 status determinations, depends on whether the service being supplied by company A to company B is truly outsourced or not. So if the service that company A is supplying to company B is genuinely outsourced or contracted out, as HMRC calls it, then company A is the client and company B is irrelevant. So company A is the client, and because it's small, the contractor determines his or her own IR35 status. If the service isn't genuinely contracted out, then this is company A, this is company B, then company B would be the client and required to undertake status assessments for any PSC contractors, even though those contractors were being engaged by company A.
Yeah, okay.
Now, HMRC has issued guidance on what they consider to be a truly outsourced service and not, but it is pretty vague. And that is deliberate because HMRC hate to be too specific because it means they then paint themselves into a corner and, you know, allow loopholes to develop. But basically what HMRC says is that they will look at whether the service provider, company A, really has ownership of delivering the entire project or services. You know, how hands-on or hands-off is company B?
Okay.
How much involvement does company B have with the individual workers engaged by company A? And the more responsibility and ownership that company A takes on, and the less involvement company B has, the more likely it is that the service is truly outsourced. But I will just pick up on one thing about this time and materials. HMRC does not like time and materials based outsourced services. I think their impression is very much no time and materials based arrangement would be considered outsourced. Okay. So I think under those circumstances, company A and company B might be on quite shaky ground if company B isn't doing status determination.
Yeah.
You know, HMRC is aware of the potential for abuse of the small company exemption in this way, you know, to outsource a service to a smaller company and then they can engage all the contractors they like because they're exempt. So I think they will look closely at subcontracted arrangements when it comes to enforcement and pick apart whether services are truly outsourced or not. And if they aren't, then company B would be held liable under the rules for not complying with their legal obligations to do SDSs. And that's, you know, it's going to cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah, it'll be a kerfuffle and it'll be an expensive one, I should imagine. We've got a handful of questions from our next contractor. Do clients realise that outside IR35 roles are between 25 to 40% cheaper than inside IR35 roles because of the contractor's increased tax burden? And linked to that, are you seeing increased rates for inside IR35 roles in the market generally? If you're deemed to be inside IR35, are you still considered an off-payroll contractor, or are you considered a fixed-term employee with associated benefits? What's gone wrong with umbrellas? There's been a lot of press about foreign-owned mini umbrella companies, and the umbrella trade bodies don't seem to be doing much about it. How can umbrella companies be fixed so we as contractors know which umbrellas to use? So some of that you've covered already, Bernie, in previous part of the conversation, but John's raising some interesting points there.
Yeah, and I'll do 1 and 2 together because I think they're sort of linked. So clients who determine roles to be outside IR35 can pay less than those to be deemed inside IR35. You know, that's definitely true. And we are already seeing rates increase in some areas. I think the problem is if you as a contractor, if you work in a saturated industry where there are lots of people who do the same work as you, then perhaps we're not seeing the same degree of increase because some people just need to take a contract to pay the bills, you know, so they've accepted inside IR35 roles without any uplift, and therefore, you know, there isn't so much pressure on the market in that area to increase the rates. But roles that have scarce or highly valued skill sets, we are definitely seeing an increase. You know, there's also the sort of the reputational and commercial you know, value of assessing contractors fairly. It's not just about the cost for clients. Yes, outside IR35 roles are cheaper, but there are really good reasons to assess fairly and therefore get good, accurate outcomes where most will be outside IR35. You know, contractors want to work with clients who are doing the right thing. Just like you said, Nina, give an accurate assessment and I'll take my lumps if it is inside. But, you know, at least let me see that you've taken the legislation seriously, you've done the right thing, you've invested in either good software or a good external expert, and that what you're telling me about the role makes sense. You know, so if those clients have taken good advice about how to engage and manage contractors going forward, a lot of those businesses, and, you know, I work with both agencies and end clients in preparation of off payroll, but it's not uncommon to have entire client businesses with 75% or more of their PSCs being outside IR35. It's not uncommon.
Yeah.
So those businesses are going to attract the best contractors because they have more roles being outside IR35.
Yeah.
And usually it will be lower rates than those deemed inside IR35 because there is no need to offset.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, in terms of the third question about what status do you have if you are deemed inside IR35? And the answer really depends on how you're being paid now that you're inside IR35. So if you're deemed inside IR35 by the client, but you are still being paid through your limited company, through your PSC, then you are still an off-payroll worker in the sense that you are not entitled to any employment rights or protections. Just because you're an employee for tax purposes does not mean you're an employee for rights purposes. However, if you're no longer using your PSC and instead you're going agency PAYE or you're using a PAYE umbrella, then you are classified as a worker. Now, as I said, that's not the same as an employee, not quite, but you are entitled to the, you know, the big meaty things: minimum wage, statutory sick pay, holiday pay, statutory maternity and paternity pay, you know, those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally, the question around umbrella companies. And again, I know I've covered it, but I think it is worth saying there have always been dodgy umbrella companies in the market, right? And actually, far more dodgy umbrellas in the past than there are now. Right. You know, 10 years ago, it was nigh on impossible to find an umbrella company that was compliant.
So we're in a better state now than we were then.
Right. It's just we have more social media now.
Yeah.
That's what it is. You know, news travels more, and there are much more conversations around tax and tax avoidance and tax evasion and disguised remuneration. So it's a more hot topic. So people are talking about it more, but the market as a whole is actually a lot more compliant than it was 10 years ago. But having said that, there will always be those who seek to evade or avoid taxes in order to increase their own profits. Government has been told for decades to regulate umbrella companies. Agencies are so highly regulated now, and almost none of those regulations apply to umbrellas. Now, the government has said, they've confirmed that they're going to be setting up a single enforcement body to protect vulnerable workers, which will amalgamate multiple other bodies that focus primarily at the moment on the activities of recruitment agencies. But umbrellas will be included in the activities of this single enforcement body.
Okay.
But that enforcement body's remit does not include tax compliance, unfortunately. I've no idea why not. Probably because that's HMRC's sole purview, and they don't want to split their enforcement time and activities with another body. Therefore, they've just taken it out completely. Now, we don't know when the single enforcement body will actually be implemented in law. The government has just said we'll do it, when parliamentary time allows. But there is increasing pressure on the government to classify the services provided by umbrella companies within a wider definition of tax advice. But even that doesn't mean that they will be properly regulated by HMRC. Instead, they'll only be regulated by a professional body, and even that's not mandatory. So what I would say is the best professional body, in my opinion, and it is my opinion, for the umbrella industry is the FCSA, the Freelancer and Contractor Services Association. It is not perfect. It has some failings. I'm not disagreeing. But if contractors and clients are looking for a compliant umbrella, an accredited FCSA member is a good starting point. I'm not saying that's all that you would do in terms of due diligence, not at all. But I would rather start with an FCSA accredited umbrella than not. Unfortunately, until there is clear regulation in place, everybody is taking a risk.
Yeah. So it's a good starting point, the FCSA, but due diligence, as you mentioned earlier in this conversation, is absolutely critical. Why are firms so reluctant to accept responsibility for the employer's NI contribution when a contract is deemed inside IR35? What is the best approach for selling the ownership of this cost to the client?
Okay, clients do not accept the employer's NICs costs because it's expensive.
Very simply put, Bernie. Yeah.
And because the off-payroll rules do not require them to pay the additional employer's NICs. And unless they're specifically required to by law, clients will find other people to absorb that cost. And unfortunately, that is normally the contractor. Now, I say that, unfortunately, it's normally the contractor, but that's because, any agencies sitting in the middle don't make anywhere near 13.8% margin. So they cannot absorb that cost themselves. So if the client won't take it, the agency can't do it because they can't supply that contractor at a loss because they won't have a viable business. And there is only one party left, and that is the contractor. Now, although I answered quite facetiously, there are lots of clients that I know of who do pay the employer's NICs cost, or they increase the rate to the contractor at, a reasonable amount to offset at least the employer's NICs and actually some of the additional income tax and employees' NICs costs. So, some clients are doing that, but ultimately, we live in a capitalist society, and it does prioritize profit over doing the right thing, which makes it very difficult to sell to a client.
Of course.
Because just saying to them, you should pay the employer's NICs because you should, because it's the right thing to do, probably is going to fall on deaf ears.
Yeah.
And all I can suggest for this particular contractor is do your best to find other roles that are outside IR35 and leave your current engagement, or look for similar roles that have the pay rate advertised. I know there aren't loads, but some are pretty good at advertising the contract rate. And if those rates are higher than yours, use that information as a more general negotiating tool rather than focusing on the sort of specific cost of the employer's.
Yeah. Interesting question. Our final question for this session, Bernie, given that implementation of the new IR35 rules has meant that contractors could no longer afford to pay for accommodation out of a taxed income and the skill shortage that has caused, do you think that some form of exemption should be made for contractors working away from home?
Yes, I do. I do think that. But on a wider scale, I think there should be a lot of exemptions and amendments to the off-payroll rule. I think that they are unworkable. I think they're too complex. I think they'll be impossible for HMRC to enforce fairly and effectively. And I think the whole thing is a mess. But HMRC, they won't be giving exemptions or issuing any amendments. They don't care about individual contractors being able to make ends meet. They are looking at it in terms of deficits within the Treasury funds.
Yeah.
So the individual is irrelevant when the financial health of the country is the priority. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's fair. And I fundamentally disagree. But that is not going to change.
No, I agree with you completely, and I think you've put that beautifully. I was on a webinar yesterday where the chief exec of Network Rail was talking about Her Majesty's Treasury, the fact that the rail industry is costing the taxpayer, has been over the last 15, 16 months, been costing the taxpayer a huge amount of money. I think it's estimated at around £800 million a month for basically trains full of fresh air and key workers, but it's been important. It's an important industry. It's important for the economy. So the Treasury's done the right thing, but obviously they are now looking for how they balance the books, and that's across the piece, isn't it? We've had such an enormous amount of support. I can still remember that session that Rishi Sunak did on the 20th of March last year when he announced the furlough scheme. Oh my God, I literally was in tears, Bernie, because it's kind of, I can't believe the government is supporting businesses to this extent. How amazing. But there's a price to pay for it, isn't there? It doesn't come for nothing, understandably. You've been brilliant. Thank you so much. I love your very straightforward style. You explain it all. I've learned loads. Clearly I know I don't know it all. I am continue to be in awe of the amount of information that you have in that head of yours, and how simply and kind of straightforward you are in terms of explaining it. So Bernie, thank you so much for joining me on this.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
I've loved it, and if we get more questions, then we may well reconvene at some point, maybe to celebrate another anniversary in months to come. But in the meantime, Bernie Payne, legal and compliance consultant and amazing friend of Intuitive, thank you so much indeed for your time today.
Thank you, Nina.
My huge thanks to Bernie Payne, legal and compliance consultant, who I think has done a great job of simplifying a really complex subject. If you have any more questions, then I'm sure that Bernie and myself would be delighted to put together another short podcast to answer those in the future. So please do let me know.